All right, it's preparing to go live. All right, I think we are officially live. Well, hi, everyone. I'm Billy Griffith with Emerging Revolutionary War. I want to welcome you to our latest installment of our Rev War Revelry. This evening, we have the privilege to welcome back Dr. Mark Edward Lender. Just a few months ago, Dr. Lender was on here talking about one of his newer books based on the Conway Cabal. And tonight he will be talking about his newest book, which my filter is making it difficult to see, but it's Fort Ticonderoga, The Last Campaigns, The War in the North, 1777 to 1783. So if you are not familiar with who Dr. Lender is, he is the Professor Emeritus of History at Kean University in New Jersey. He's also the author or co-author of 12 books and many articles on early American military, social, and institutional history, including previously mentioned Cabal, The Plot Against George Washington, Fatal Sunday, George Washington, The Monmouth Campaign, and the Politics of Battle. That's with Gary Wheeler Stone, and also A Respectable Army, The Military Origins of the Republic, 1763 to 1789, with James Kirby Martin. So, Dr. Lender, I want to thank you for joining us here tonight to discuss your newest book. I'm sure our audience is very happy to see you on here again. So, the first question that I would like to ask you, while approaching this subject, which is one that's not too often read by many, what drew you to write about this period in Fort Ticonderoga's history?
Billy, this is both an academic question and a personal, believe it or not. When I was a kid, I was 12, 13 years old. We used to vacation, my family used to vacation in the Adirondacks. In fact, we had a place on Saranac Lake, not too far from Ticonderoga. And we took a day trip to Ticonderoga. And I was just, typical kid, couldn't wait to get away from my parents. And I wandered off into this fort, which was then under heavy reconstruction and renovation. And I lost my parents for about 2.5 hours, or they lost me. I got into areas where you can't go today. Security is a lot better. But I got the bug. And Ticonderoga was really one of the areas that got me started thinking about how much I enjoyed history. And it never left me. And we've been back to Ticonderoga several times since. And so when an opportunity came along to write about the fort and its importance, its role, particularly in the American Revolution, which became a rear pattern for me, I couldn't wait to accept. I mean, I was invited as one of 3 historians. This is going to be a trilogy of at the Citadel. Professor let's see, it will be Dave Preston writing at the Citadel about the colonial period of the fort, and James Kirby Martin, a good friend and co-author of mine, and a number of other works, as you mentioned, will be writing about the early part of the American Revolution, and I was asked to write about the latter part of the American Revolution, 1777, the end of the war. And while I was number 3 in the trilogy, I'm the one who's done, and I know Jim and Dave are working on theirs, so I'd really be interested to see what they come up with. But each of the books will be a standalone. So if you don't want to read the others, I've got a brief introduction and taking it from the founding of the fort down to the period I'm focused on. But it was a matter of almost a labor of love for me. I really enjoyed writing this project. It's not one I would have done had I not been invited to do it. But right on, I don't know, it couldn't have been more on the money to be asked to write about an institution that really got me going as a historian. It was a lot of fun. I worked very, very closely with staff at Fort Ticonderoga. One of the things that people don't know about the fort is that it's also a museum with a wonderful manuscript collection. I got into stuff that other historians simply have not touched. So it was really kind of an adventure to see what I could find that other historians had not been able to use. And it's there, and it's a wealth of detail, and luckily it's in the care of a museum staff, knows what they're doing, knows where their materials are, and is more than willing to help. They were just unbelievable to work. Just, one of the one of the most enjoyable projects I've ever undertaken. That's a long way of saying, yeah, I got into this because I really enjoyed it, and I did. I did.
Yeah, no, I had kind of the same beginnings too when it came to my passion for history. Family would always vacation at Lake George every year, so it was Fort William Henry and Fort Ticonderoga where
Yeah.
my seeds were planted. So you do talk in the beginning of the book, really going through just describing the picturesque, the beauty of this area. That one visiting there, they are drawn to it. You could literally, it's one of the only places I think in the country that you can really stand and you can literally feel like the past, living and breathing around you. It's just an incredible place in this country. So kind of describe the geography of the region that Fort Ticonderoga is situated within. Why was the fort constructed there, and what was the military significance of that ground?
Well, as you say, the region itself is breathtakingly beautiful. It's in the summer and in the winter, but in the fall, it's absolutely magnificent. Beyond the picturesque nature of it, it's as in real estate, location can be everything, and in military affairs, location can be everything as well. And that was certainly the case for Ticonderoga. The fort is at a choke point of what became known as the Great Path, the shortest way to get from New York to Montreal, Quebec province in Canada, Hudson River, and you make a jump at Fort Edward. It takes you a very short route to Lake George, go up Lake George, and actually you're going down Lake George because the water moves toward the St. Lawrence River, not in the other direction. So the water is moving north. So you go down Lake George, and there's a short river, the Lachute, 3 miles, turbulent water, a lot of rapids, and it dumps you into Lake Champlain. Lake Champlain is over 100 miles long. It takes you on up into Quebec province in Canada. It was the main transportation route from southern colonies up to French Canada, would eventually be British Canada after the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War. So it was a main transportation route, and it's the choke point. Look at it on a map. Lake Champlain by Ticonderoga is only a quarter of a mile wide. And that's where all shipping had to pass. And the easiest way to transport goods, transport people, including military operations, was by water. Now, you could do it over land, but of course, that took forever. And the road network was rudimentary. So frankly, a lot of the period we're talking about, the road network was non existent. It was during the French and Indian War that some of the rudimentary roads, simply because armies moving simply literally hacked their way through the woods. I mean, it was one thing for infantry to move, but you had to move a wagon, you had to move artillery. No, you needed some sort of. And it was during that period when the roads began to go in, they were very, very rudimentary and very, very few. So the best way to transport anything was by water. And Ticonderoga commanded the choke point in the waterway. Fort held Ticonderoga had an opportunity to close off transportation between the northern and southern regions of America. The fort was called the key to the continent because if you really couldn't move, somebody who opposed you controlled Ticonderoga. The mountains on both sides are quite dramatic, and if you control both the high ground and Ticonderoga itself, you're in the catbird seat as far as controlling the key terrain and the key terrain in North America. So building a fort there made all the sense in the world.
And that fort, even though it was in a dilapidated state at the beginning of the war, will be captured by the Americans fairly early in 1775. But you don't start your story there. You really pick up your story during the winter of 1776 into 1777. Now, this is a part of Ticonderoga's history that I don't think you really can read anywhere else about. At least I haven't found anything. Kind of the periods where not much is going on. So maybe it's why people don't necessarily or aren't drawn to that kind of history. But I found it really fascinating reading about that winter because none other than Anthony Wayne is in command there at Fort Ticonderoga. And this is definitely a time in his military career that we don't really hear much about. So give us a brief overview of that winter and the difficulties that Wayne and his garrison may have had to face.
Well, you're right. The fort was in dilapidated condition when in 1775, of course, in their famous raid, Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold took it. The British knew the trouble was brewing, and they had laid plans to refurbish and re-garrison Ticonderoga, but it was too late. The Americans took it before the British could really do anything. But in 1776, the winter of 1776, fort became the rallying point for the American army that was retreating from Canada. American invasion of Canada of 1775, early 1776 had failed. The British had mounted a counterattack. The Americans were driven willy-nilly away. It was a disaster. Ticonderoga became the logical place to rally. It was a place that, it was a fixed fortification. The Americans began to repair the fort, to construct outworks. They took the old French lines that had been constructed so that to hold the fort against the British, because we have to remember, it was originally Fort Carillon. The French had built it during the French and Indian War. Now the British took it, but the French defensive lines were still there. The Americans repaired those out. They're outside of the fort. So an awful lot of work was going on. And you're right. In late 1776, the commander who helped reorganize the American army at Fort Ticonderoga was Horatio Gates, left to go south, bring his troops south so Washington could mount the Trenton, Princeton. And so you had troops who served at Ticonderoga ended up fighting under Washington at Trenton. But leaving behind, you had a garrison fort. It was Anthony Wayne. And here is, I thought, an interesting chapter in Wayne's career because it demonstrated what kind of an officer Anthony Wayne was. Hot-tempered. He hated Ticonderoga. I think it's one of the most beautiful areas you can find. You should read what Anthony Wayne had to say about it. It was one of the last places on earth that God had created, and he botched the job. Actually, he just couldn't stand it. What he really couldn't stand, a guy who was impulsive, hot-tempered. He was a combat officer. He was not a garrison officer, and his job was to take a shorthanded staff. He didn't have all, he had a couple of thousand men. He had officers, some of whom he didn't like, didn't get along with. And he had to defend this place. He had to make it defensible at a time when he didn't have the manpower, he didn't have the resources that he wanted. He was constantly appealing to the Continental Congress, constantly appealing to local officials, the New York governor, even the independent Republic of Vermont. We'll get into that later. To send reinforcements, he was writing to the Massachusetts authorities, to New Hampshire authorities. Just he needed guns, he needed money, he needed manpower, and he could never get enough. And of course, he was going ballistic over it. And to read his letters at the time were the letters of a man who, as far as he was concerned, was facing an impossible task, and he really was. And all things considered, I think he made the best of a bad situation. He did fairly well on the very thin resources that were at his command, but he hated every day there. He could not wait to be reassigned. And he left in early April of 1777 and never looked back. I mean, he never had a good word to say about Ticonderoga, but he couldn't wait to get down to join Washington, where, of course, he made his reputation as a combat commander. That was where he was happiest. I think that as far as he was concerned, probably the lowest point of his military career was his command at Fort Ticonderoga. In retrospect, I would, of course, disagree with him because given what he was faced with, I think he did a pretty good job. But good Lord, he was not happy. He certainly was not. And it's a part of Anthony Wayne. that is overlooked, and I think it really speaks volumes about what kind of a commander he was. Don't put this man in what he would consider a backwater. Don't put him into a job which was essentially just administrative and tedious, and having to deal with how many nails he was going to need, how many kegs of lead he was going to need. No, he was a combat commander. Put him in the field and put him in action. That's what kind of a guy Anthony was. That's the unsexy parts of military history he wanted nothing to do with.
So Fort Ticonderoga's role in the Revolution is really highlighted by its capture by Allen and Arnold in May 1775, but also its capture by the British during the Saratoga campaign. So let's talk a little bit about the opposing forces during that summer of 1777 and who some of the key players are going to be at the onset of the Saratoga campaign.
Sure. It's important, I think, to look at that campaign from the perspective of 1777, not from the perspective of 2022, when we know what happened.
Mm-hmm.
Every time he took a step south, we know that Burgoyne was headed eventually to Saratoga, and and his army was doomed. In the summer of 1777, we sure didn't know that. And as Burgoyne came south from Canada, his first operational objective was Fort Ticonderoga, for the reasons we mentioned. Ticonderoga was the choke point. It was the key section that you had to take if you were going to have free transportation of the Lake George, Lake Champlain network. And that's how he was bringing his army south. So his first major objective was Ticonderoga, and everybody considered Ticonderoga sort of the Gibraltar of North America. Take it, and good things are going to follow. So he honed in on it. It was operationally a great success. I don't think that Burgoyne can really be faulted for anything he did in organizing his drive on Fort Ticonderoga. He had very, very able subordinates. He had the authority to create brigadier generals. Brigadier general is not a regular rank in the British Army, was not then a regular rank in the British Army. It was by brevet, a temporary rank that could be assigned to an officer for a specific campaign or a specific area. And Burgoyne was authorized to name, he took lieutenant colonels and made them brigadier generals. And he picked very, very good people. He had officers around him who, solid professionals, knew what they were doing. He had a major general in William Phillips, an artillerist, maybe the best artillerist in the British Army, and that was his second in command. And in guys like Simon Fraser, Powell, you had officers who had an enormous amount of experience, knew what they were doing, and frankly were the envy of the American officer corps. If Washington had folks like Washington, ultimately would develop a good officer corps. But Burgoyne started with one, and they came in, they were organized. He also had Baron Risley, the Hessian commander, who, no, oh boy, did I just make a mistake. You don't call these guys Hessians. They were not Hessians. They were Brunswickers, and they were touchy about it. They came from the German Principality of Brunswick, which was one of the principalities like Hesse-Ansbach, and those were Hessians, under contract with and they were considered allies, not mercenaries, but allies of the British Crown. And he had a very, very competent commander in the Brunswick Major General Izzet. So he had people he could trust what they were doing. And at the beginning, he had a formidable number of Indians who were allied with him. So you had American Indians, you had the Brunswickers, you had veteran British troops, or veteran British officers anyway. Not all the troops were veteran, but most of them. We had an army that was, frankly, sort of the epitome of British professionalism in the late 18th century. Again, the Americans really couldn't match that. what did the Americans have to defend Ticonderoga? Well, at this point, and I go into the politics of it in the book because of the command at Fort Ticonderoga became a political hotbed. Ultimately, in June of 1777, the commander on the spot was Arthur St. Clair, Major General Arthur St. Clair. St. Clair was a George Washington loyalist. Washington respected him, considered him a sound officer, and he was not a bad officer, as a matter of fact. His reputation is not really, it's taken a lot of buffeting from historians over the years, but not necessarily from what we're talking about today, and we will talk about what. But he had about a month for Ticonderoga prepared, and he faced the same difficulties that Anthony Wayne. Too few men, versus because of the presence of loyalists and the Indian allies of Burgoyne. St. Clair also had too little understanding of what the British were up to. He knew the British were coming. His intelligence wasn't real good. He knew he was outnumbered. He didn't know by what extent he was outnumbered. He knew the approximate routes the British would have to take. He didn't know the exact routes the British would have to take. He did not know, for example, that the British would take their main army down as you're coming up Lake Champlain. How many of them would march overland? How many of them would actually come down by the lake? How many would go over to the other side, what is today the Vermont side, and march down that way? As it turned out, the Royal Navy had sent Skeffington Lutwidge,
Great name.
a classic English sea dog. He was Horatio Nelson was a junior officer under this fellow, and just no nonsense Royal Navy officer who commanded the fleet coming down Lake Champlain. All of this was simply an overpowering force. Let's see, St. Clair really had under 3,000 effective, and he was looking at an enemy that outnumbered him better than 2 to 1. After Valcour Island in 1776, the Americans had literally no naval presence north of Ticonderoga that might have tried to interdict. Luckily, it didn't, because only 3 or 4 vessels survived Valcour Island, and they were south of the fort. If they had tried to oppose Lutwidge, they'd have just been destroyed. So St. Clair is caught. What is he going to do? The action that developed in early July of 1777, was brought on as Burgoyne approached. And Burgoyne was quite skillful. He did not want to repeat the mistakes the British had made in 1758 when they attacked the French-held Ticonderoga in what is section called the French Lines. It's northwest of the fort. And the British were just mowed down in 1758, and Burgoyne didn't want to have anything to do with that. He figured he would envelop the fort slowly and actually mount siege operations, compel the Americans to surrender. There was some pretty heavy skirmishing as Burgoyne closed, but as it turned out, he didn't have to launch siege operations because wasn't William Phillip, artillery commander, who spotted it first, but British who understood that if you could get to the top of a mountain, maybe less than a mile, maybe half a mile away, called Sugarloaf. The British called it Sugarloaf. The Americans called it Mount Defiance. If you could mount artillery on top of it, you would command Fort Ticonderoga. You would not only command Fort Ticonderoga, you'd command that strip of the lake, and you'd even command the American positions on Mount Independence, which are just the other side of the plain. The Americans knew they were vulnerable over there, but they never really thought you could get artillery up there, at least not up there. To their amazement, as they looked up on July the 5th, they saw redcoats up there and they knew what was up. They just knew at that point the game was up. I give St. Clair a lot of credit. It took some real fortitude to say, look, I'm going to abandon this post, knowing full well that if he gave up Ticonderoga, there would be a political firestorm and his name would be mud. But the alternative was to stay and fight what was ultimately a hopeless battle. They would have been routed. And not only would Ticonderoga have been lost, the American army in the north would have been lost. One of the troops that got away with St. Clair when they abandoned it on the 6th of July ended up fighting under Horatio Gates to defeat Burgoyne at Saratoga. So it was a courageous decision on his part, particularly in the 18th century, when a lot of officers, frankly, were so consumed by the idea of reputation and personal honor that to fight to the death was, frankly, a decision a lot of them would have made rather than to give up. No, he understood that that army had to be saved. Got out in the nick of time, just in the nick of time. But, and so, yes, the fort fell to the British in early July of 1777 and became a British bastion. Even as Burgoyne moved south, marched past Lake George, supplies came down the waterway at Lake George. Ultimately, he crossed the area of just a little south of Fort Edward and put him on the Hudson River and began his march towards Saratoga.
Yeah,
But Fort Ticonderoga was still garrisoned. I mean, it became his supply center. And if reinforcements were coming south from Canada, they had to come to Ticonderoga first and then get transported. If supplies, which were stocked at Ticonderoga, which Burgoyne desperately needed, I mean, Ticonderoga was still key to the British campaign, even as Burgoyne moved.
And that's a good segue into our next question. So an often overlooked part of the Saratoga campaign is the American operations against Burgoyne's army, his rear, as he advanced toward his rendezvous with destiny at Saratoga. So tell us a little bit about what was going on in the British rear and what was this impact on the campaign in its entirety?
A little bit. Actually, it's one of my favorite parts. I'm going to tell you a lot. Okay. Look, one of the overlooked things about Ticonderoga is that because it was so important to Burgoyne's march to the south, George Washington, who was then campaigning in the Philadelphia area, understood and sent orders north to Horatio Gates. Again, the politics of this whole thing. Horatio Gates is back. And he sends to Horatio Gates, look, can you do anything to interdict Burgoyne's supply operations? And if you can interdict the supply operations, he becomes vulnerable. And so even before Gates took command up there, he had sent word to Major General Benjamin Lincoln, go north, go into what is modern Vermont, organize what militia you can. If you can scrape up some Continentals, great, but put together some sort of an operation that might disturb or disrupt, if not completely cut off, the British ability to resupply Burgoyne from Fort Ticonderoga. Gates was fully aboard with this, and by this time, it's interesting to watch the relationship between Gates and Washington because it was beginning to go sour. But they acted professionally in this regard, and Gates, who was the Northern commander, backed Lincoln, approved Lincoln's, and it was Lincoln's plan. Gates was preparing to meet Burgoyne at Saratoga, told Lincoln to go to it, get into the rear of the British, and do what you could to disrupt their supplies. Lincoln zeroed in on Ticonderoga. If we can hit Ticonderoga, we will really mess up Burgoyne's ability to bring troops south and to bring new supplies south, food, ammunition, carts, transportation, everything. He really didn't want to capture Ticonderoga. He didn't have to. The idea was to disrupt British logistics operations. It was a three-pronged attack. I'll focus on just one aspect of it. Colonel John Brown. Whenever I say, John Brown's raid, people think of that other John Brown 100 years later. He was a Massachusetts Continental officer who had resigned his Continental commission because he got in an argument with Benedict Arnold the year before. But he was still a colonel in the Massachusetts militia. Lincoln tasked him with a raid on Ticonderoga in September of 1777. British had taken the fort in July of 1777. We're going to move south. He left a small garrison behind, and in the book I explain how the garrison changed, who was in charge, what they tried to do. But you had a relatively thin garrison composed chiefly of a Brunswick regiment, the Prince Frederick Regiment of Brunswickers, and the 53rd Foot of the British Army. Some Royal Navy personnel as well, Provincial Navy, but Royal Navy also. They were taken completely by surprise on 21 September. Colonel John Brown managed to get on the high ground overlooking the fort, launched an attack by surprise. British security was very, very lax. Tactically, Brown was very, very skilled. Really showed what a mixed continental militia operation could do. And it showed the militia and Continentals, because there were some Continental regulars involved, accomplish if they were carefully coordinated. Today, we call it compound warfare between regular and irregular troops working in concert, getting the best out of it. They overwhelmed the 53rd outside of the fort, scooped up several hundred British prisoners, released a couple of hundred American prisoners taken prisoner when the fort fell in July, and then been put to work on building roads and moving supplies. They were rearmed with the weapons captured from the 3rd. They swept toward the fort. Brown didn't bother to storm the fort. There was really no point in it, but for several days, there was a back and forth of artillery exchange between the guns the Americans captured. They captured the guns on Mount Defiance that had forced the surrender of Fort Ticonderoga in July, and simply turned them loose on the fort again. And we have accounts of this from the British side, the American side, and the Brunswick side, for that matter. The Brunswickers were writing about this as well. It was a pretty dramatic operation, and it was hugely successful in disrupting British logistics. Everything that Washington, Gates, and Lincoln had hoped for. And the British were really distressed by it. They couldn't imagine how the Americans had gotten back of them like that. It was a major morale boost for the American army. Word reached Gates's forces at Saratoga, where there had already first engagements. Freeman's Farm had already taken place. So the British all of a sudden here cheering on the American side over there. Couldn't understand what all the ruckus was about. Gates was smart enough to say, this kind of understanding the psychological aspect of warfare, briefed a British prisoner on what had happened at Ticonderoga and released him, sent him back to Burgoyne to spread the word. And it was really a real downer for the British to know that not only were they facing increasing American resistance in front, but retreat back to Ticonderoga, which some officers wanted. Let's get out of here and get back to Ticonderoga when we can. Do it anymore. It just wasn't safe to turn around. So this was a big deal. And John Brown he was killed in 1780 at the Battle of Stone Arabia in New York State. Sort of forgotten today. There's not even a formal portrait. He was one of the few relatively senior Americans who didn't have a portrait. But we don't know what John Brown looked like, but he certainly made a tremendous contribution to the campaign of 1777. So that's a little bit I was going to say.
So following the Saratoga campaign, the British would draw back to Canada. Do the Americans at all reoccupy Ticonderoga or does the post kind of lose importance after the focus of Britain's military efforts later shift more towards the southern colonies?
The fort sort of went into the doldrums for a couple of years, and the action after Burgoyne's surrender did not end fighting in the north, but the fighting assumed a different form. You had a new governor in Quebec, Frederick Haldimand. He was both the commander-in-chief of British forces in Canada and the governor, the royal governor of Quebec. And he's believed in what I call in the book aggressive defense. I mean, he would launch raids into what became Vermont. He would launch and raids into northern New York State. He would reach, some of his forces reached Ticonderoga again, but the Americans did not re-garrison it. Why? It didn't make sense to put troops up there when the major fighting had indeed shifted to the south. I mean, after 1777, the British really gave up seeking a military solution in the northern colonies. It just had stalemated them, didn't look particularly promising. So they thought maybe a campaign in the American South would be better. Their forces were redeployed from the north to the American South, to Florida, to the very economically valuable sugar colonies in the Caribbean islands. But Haldimand was definitely afraid. He didn't have that many troops either, but he was afraid another American thrust toward Canada might take place. So he probed, he constantly probed, he constantly sent raiding parties in to keep the Americans off balance. And Ticonderoga did figure in this, but not in any strategically important way. I mean, troops came and went. They used it as a rendezvous point, but there's no more fighting at Ticonderoga. There was fighting in the general area, but Ticonderoga was no longer a tactical or an operational objective. So yes, the area was militarily important, but Ticonderoga itself didn't have the importance.
So in your book, you do discuss some of those raids that you had mentioned, which obviously that part of New York as well as Western New York and then Vermont, as you do say in your book, really do feel the hard hand of war by these British raiding parties coming down. So you cover many of them. Can you tell us about a few of them? If you think that what were the most successful ones? What were they targeting? What kind of damage were they trying to inflict?
The northern theater, in many ways, again, it remained important as a transportation corridor. Occasionally, the Americans did think of heading up toward Canada, and so Americans probed north. But most of the really destructive stuff came out of Canada, and the Americans used, particularly the Mohawk Valley, not that far from Ticonderoga. It was one of the breadbaskets of the colonial rebellion. The Mohawk Valley, the farms fed the Continental Army. And the British understood that if they could burn it out, and they did try, had major raids in 1780 that frankly rolled the frontier over 1780 from Ontario back to Schenectady, New York. It just rolled the frontier back. You had maybe 10,000 people had to flee. Thousands of farms were burned out. It was an attempt, frankly, to the American Revolution would not die militarily. Maybe it could starve it to death. I mean, really starve their armies. That failed. When Brown was killed at Stone Arabia, he was fighting off one of those raids. The raids were chiefly the work of a corps of redcoats, just a few redcoats. And Haldimand didn't have that many to really send in major expeditions. But you had a large forces of loyalists and allied, mostly Iroquois American Indians, who understood that an American victory for them would have been a catastrophe. That after an American victory, their hold on their homelands would have been very tenuous, probably impossible. So the fighting was very bitter. A lot of it was small scale fighting, but it was no holds barred, horrendous in the bloodletting that. very, very bitter. You had one raid by Major Carleton, who came out of New York, rendezvous just north at Crown Point, which is just north of Ticonderoga. Then his forces moved to Ticonderoga. They went down the Vermont side into New York, and they in that raid they probably burned out what they estimated would have supported an American army of several thousand men for a campaign season. Now, this is not necessarily the sexiest part of military history, I mean, with armies clashing and everything. But what you've got is an understanding that armies have to eat. And if an army can't eat, it can't function. And what the British were doing was deliberately hitting the agricultural base that sustained the American ability to fight. The Americans knew it. The Americans knew it. So this was, it was important. I mean, the victory at Saratoga certainly did not end the fighting in the North. The fighting just took on a different phase. So this is, the fighting was around Ticonderoga. Occasionally it touched on Ticonderoga, but it was a fight over Ticonderoga.
So in your book, you also discuss kind of not just the military aspects involving Fort Ticonderoga, but political aspects as well. And one thing I found interesting is that I think 1780 or so, a man who, if you're familiar with the Saratoga campaign, you're definitely familiar with, Barry St. Leger, actually finds himself in command at Fort Ticonderoga when British troops do return there. So what role does Fort Ticonderoga play in the discussions that were ongoing between the Crown and representatives of modern day Vermont or the New Hampshire grants?
This was, I found one of the most interesting parts of what I was digging out. It's well known by historians that Vermont had its difficulties with the rest of the American Revolution. Vermont was not recognized by New York. New York claimed a lot of the territory that became modern Vermont, and Connecticut, New Hampshire, even Massachusetts had some claims to the territory that became Vermont. The New York objections were so vociferous that the Continental Congress, not wanting to offend New York, and New York was critical to the revolutionary cause, not wanting to offend New York, refused to recognize Vermont wanted inclusion in the Continental Congress and wanted congressional recognition of its statehood. They wanted to be the state of Vermont. Failing that, they declared themselves the Republic. And most of the time during the Revolution, the Republic of Vermont lent its resources, including manpower, to the Revolution. Over time, real resentment grew in Vermont. Why, we're contributing to the. We look at what we did earlier in the war. Ethan Allen and the Allen family was a big deal in Vermont. Ethan Allen was one of the main leaders in Vermont. His brother Ira was just as important politically in Vermont, and they won't recognize us. How do we secure our land titles here? How do we secure our ability to function politically? And who do they think they are, not recognizing what we've done for them and how important we can be up here? So maybe the British Crown might recognize. Now, there's always been this thing. The Allens were involved in this. They were up to it, up to their eyeballs. Were they really serious about returning Vermont to the Crown? And the argument was that as long as the British were willing to recognize autonomy and were willing to recognize Vermont land titles, yeah, they'd rejoin the empire. Or was it just a bluff to get the Congress finally and the other Americans to recognize Vermont as a state? I think they were serious about rejoining the empire. And the British were really intrigued by the idea that they might be able to lure Vermont back. Now, Haldeman considered this part of his defensive strategy. If I can get Vermont at least to stop materially aiding the Americans, not necessarily rejoining the empire, but there's a huge chunk of territory he doesn't have to worry about defending. If Vermont is really going to be serious about rejoining the empire or even talking about it, he doesn't have to worry about Vermont being used as a launching pad for another American assault on Quebec. So, I mean, if you can get him to rejoin the empire, well and good. So in 1781, he sends a relatively large force, almost 1,800, to Fort Ticonderoga. And they set up at Ticonderoga. So they reoccupied it. They begin to repair the barracks. The Americans really thought the British would come back to stay. And in Albany, New York, the American command honestly thought this is it. The British were coming again. They had fears that a major British invasion was on the way. It wasn't. What the British had done, Haldeman had sent these troops to Ticonderoga to bolster diplomatic efforts, to talk to the Allens and other Vermont senior political officials about rejoining the empire. The ostensive reason, the public reason for all this was to arrange a prisoner exchange. The real reason, give some muscle. I mean, Vermont know that the British had forces they could use to help them if they rejoined the empire. Talks were ongoing, continued into the fall. Then word came north. Cornwallis had surrendered at Yorktown, and that was it. The British backed out. They realized that word reached Vermont. Vermont authorities said, hurrah for the revolution. And the British packed up in November. They were gone and never came back. So that was it for Ticonderoga. It served as a rendezvous one more time later in the war, and that was for a prisoner.
Okay.
So you had, the war is over. There's a meeting between Continental and British authorities, and several hundred prisoners from both sides back and forth. Militarily, that was it. Fort Ticonderoga. The revolution is won. The Americans control the entire waterway of Champlain, Lake George. I mentioned earlier that location is everything in real estate. A good deal of the same is true in military affairs. Location no longer mattered. The Americans control it all. And Ticonderoga, frankly, became a very picturesque ruin. It was the Hudson River School of Painting loved to go up and paint the ruins of Ticonderoga. And until it was restored, beginning in the 19 teens and into the 20s, it was a picturesque ruin. Farmers used the dressed stone for walls. The artillery was taken and melted down for iron. The artillery carriages were chopped up and used for firewood and fences and everything else. It was just never garrisoned again. There was no reason to.
So thank you again for your time tonight. I got one more question for you before we close this out. But researching a topic like this, that's not necessarily extensively written about, what obstacles did you face while you were actually completing this project?
Asking me what obstacles I faced, to tell you the truth, I can't think of anything that we really could consider an obstacle. As I said earlier, I had full support of the museum staff. I did have an opportunity to get to the archive at the New York Public Library, the New York Historical Society, also in New York City, the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, I could stay with one of our kids lives in the town, so I didn't, you don't have to go after a fellowship or something to take advantage of this, and just getting into New York was not all that difficult. So it was one of the more enjoyable projects I've had an opportunity to pursue. As far as difficulties, I'm not going to say that any project is just a piece of, but this is as close to it as I think I've ever been involved with. And the next one I'm working on right now is in the neck, to tell you the truth. And there's getting to different sources is difficult, and and making it organized is difficult. This it sort of fell into place in just a very, very ready fashion. I can't think of a project, frankly, that I've enjoyed more. It
Good.
beautifully.
Well, it definitely is an enjoyable book. So if anybody hasn't picked it up yet, I definitely recommend it to learn more about what we've been discussing tonight. But thank you again, Dr. Lender, for joining us here this evening. We will not have a Rev War Revelry 2 weeks from tonight because that is Christmas. So our next one is going to be on January 8th, and that will be a discussion about a set of maps detailing the Battle of Brandywine done by a British cartographer. So thank you again, everybody, for tuning in tonight. Thank you again, Dr. Lender, and we wish everybody a happy holiday season. Good night.
Thank you, Billy, and Merry Christmas. Happy holidays to everybody. Thanks a lot.